watching Channel Africa Conversations.
Of course, I'm also motivated, by the fact that the AfDB has never had a woman leader. And I think that, it's time that that happened because, I'm of the firm view that if development and discussions on development don't involve women, we're not going to develop.
Hello and welcome to Channel Africa Conversations. I'm your host, Peter Ndoro. Today we're in conversation with Swazi Tshabalala, a highly respected figure in African finance and development. She's officially declared her candidacy for the presidency of the African Development Bank, the AfDB, bringing extensive experience and a strong leadership track record. With a career spanning nearly 3 decades, Tshabalala has held key roles in both the public and the private sectors, including being Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the AfDB. Her bid for the presidency has received significant backing, notably from the South African government, reinforcing her commitment to driving Africa's development agenda forward. Swazi Tshabalala, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Channel Africa Conversations.
Thank you very much for having me.
Swazi, this is a big job that you've put your candidacy forward to. Perhaps we can start with a look at your career and your journey before the African Development Bank, just to give us a clue of what you think you're able to bring to this job from what you've done over the years.
So I have been in finance practically my entire life. And, I studied finance, and before that I studied economics. So I was very, very interested, in fact, even at university, on issues related to Africa's development. I came back to South Africa in order to work initially in insurance, but didn't enjoy that that much, and joined banking. And that was a very interesting journey for me because it was right at the time of South Africa's transition to democracy. So, I was very interested in the story of South Africa and how it was evolving. But obviously, my time at the Standard Bank, I was a trader, trading interest rate derivatives. It may sound very far from development, but it's related. And then I moved to Transnet after that, where I spent 10 years, working with, actually I must say, very, very privileged to have worked with people like Sakima Kozoma, Tomato Sirobe, and ultimately with Maria Ramos when she became CEO, and I was her group treasurer. And it was an interesting time at Transnet. It had a lot of problems when I joined. It was a very interesting view being a corporate treasurer rather than being a bank, treasury expert, because, you take those lessons from banking and you apply them to a corporate environment with real consequences. If you think about investment in infrastructure, if you think about, the risk management at the state-owned enterprises, this is all very important work. I then transitioned to, private sector, you could call it that. So I went private sector, public sector, and then private sector, where I worked with a company called IDG, and then subsequently Barbican Advisory, where we worked on projects all over the continent. I remember, for instance, advising the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo on how they can, restructure and transform one of their state-owned assets. It was, my first visit to the DRC, and it was just staggering for me to see the enormous potential of the country. And I think finally for me, it dropped how important the role of government is in development, because I think there's a tendency to think MDBs can solve everything, but if you don't have strong partnership with the country and strong commitment from the country, that's is challenging. And then I went into board positions. I was on the board of Liberty, and then I was on the board of Standard Bank. I was on the board of Tiger Brands during a very challenging time, if you recall, with the listeria issue. So, and then I was on the board of MTN. So particularly Standard Bank and MTN gave me the opportunity to look at a business on a Pan-African, perspective, and how these private sector businesses navigate, more or less the same challenges, in fact, that, multilateral development banks have to deal with, but looking at it from a private sector perspective, and looking at what are the minimum requirements for the private sector to be able to invest, in countries that on the face of it may look too risky. And it's an important lesson, one that I hope I will have the opportunity to talk to international investors about, that there's always opportunity with the right planning, and the right leadership.
Talking about leadership, you are applying for the job of president of the African Development Bank. Why do you want this job? What do you hope to do?
So, I mean, as I said, I've been interested in Africa's development, since university. It's a very bewildering, maybe in some ways, that the richest continent, in my view, is also the poorest continent. It makes no sense. And, in the same way that I was very much driven to come back from my studies in the United States and contribute, I could have stayed, many of my peers stayed, but, I felt very strongly that my skills, my background was needed in Africa rather than in the United States. So this is a deep, deep passion for me. I'm not one of those people that took a second passport. I'm not confused about where my loyalties lie. And I am deeply committed to making sure that I make my contribution to the development of the continent. So on a basic fundamental level, that's really what drives me. Even when I joined the African Development Bank, it looked odd, even to me initially. But, once I was there, I understood the power of that organization and its importance as a partner to the African Union member countries in developing the continent. So, but in addition to that, I do think that I bring a unique set of attributes. Previous presidents of the African Development Bank have largely come from the realm of politicians, so previous ministers, for instance. And, there's been an evolution. I think this was probably true for all MDBs globally, but there's been an evolution in other MDBs where increasingly you are seeing private sector expertise being brought in to actually drive development and change. And I think it's time. Of course, I'm also motivated, by the fact that the AfDB has never had a woman leader. And I think that, it's time that happened, because, I'm of the firm view that if development and discussions on development don't involve women, we're not going to develop.
Yeah, for sure. Nearly 70 years this bank has been running, and no woman president. I think a lot of people will be very happy if that changes. So, in your first year, let's assume you've been appointed. What are going to be your top 3 priorities?
So, So I mean, take a step back. So the bank obviously has a great deal of capital, which has, increased significantly, in the last 10 years, which gives us, or gives the institution a lot of firepower. But I think that despite the organizational changes that have happened to try and accommodate, the deployment of that firepower, there's a lot of work to be done. So one of the biggest problems that MDBs have, and I must be clear that it's not just the AfDB that has this problem, is the fact that we will approve financing. I mean, the bank approves up to $10 billion a year in financing, and this is just bank financing. Often in our projects, we will include co-financiers. So the amounts are big. And then we will take, the next 3 to 5 years before we deploy that money. So for me, this is a major, because you can approve, but if you don't deploy to actually build projects, you're not developing. So for me, this is a priority, especially in the area of infrastructure, which is really, in my view, the biggest constraint that Africa faces in development. So the first thing that I would do is look carefully at internally what we are doing that can be improved. So I would put in place a task force which would look at infrastructure specifically and our approach to how we deploy financing for infrastructure. So and that task force would really have 100 days to develop a roadmap for implementation of accelerated processes and procedures for making sure that when we approve financing, within months, we are able to start deploying that financing. The second aspect of it, of course, is that because this is a partnership, the bank works to support countries. It's important to me that we play our role as well in ensuring that we support the capacity of the project implementation units in these countries to be able to deliver projects. So I am considering creating, and I had been considering it already when I was senior vice president, creating a project agnostic team that would help to work with teams, internal teams, and the project implementation units to basically troubleshoot the issues that cause delays in making sure that projects are shovel ready. So that would be the second priority. And of course, the third priority is that I would look at the internal organization to see how we can further fine-tune, because there had already been organizational changes, particularly how we deliver infrastructure. Currently, we have separate complexes that deliver different types of infrastructure. But my view is that infrastructure is infrastructure and should really be consolidated in one complex. Why do I say that? If you think about it, if you build a road and you have a team that builds a road, but doesn't think about, well, is there an opportunity here to put digital infrastructure alongside this road? And is there an opportunity to put electricity, as an example? You then end up with projects that are not consolidated and don't have the transformational impact that we are looking for. So those would be my priorities. Obviously, this would be in the sort of first 2 years of my presidency, but there would be other priorities going forward. But those, I would argue, would be the most important ones, because as I said, the infrastructure constraints that Africa faces are crucial, to be addressed in order to drive growth.
Sadly, corruption and mismanagement is something that's all too common on our continent. In the work that you do and the bank does, how do you manage this? Because some of your projects actually then are vulnerable to this kind of chicanery, for want of a better word. And you then struggle with loan repayments. How do you account, especially for people who are members of your bank?
I mean, first of all, I would like to dispel the notion that there's a pervasive problem. Certainly not from our projects, from the bank's projects. The bank has a pretty extensive system of oversight in terms of the financing of projects. In fact, some of the reasons for the delay, for instance, in disbursing is precisely because the bank is trying to ensure that that money goes for the purposes for which it was approved. So, and I think this is important, and we need, I would certainly double down on it, working with countries to make sure that there's absolute clarity in how money is spent on projects, that are approved. But of course, this extends to procurement practices in some countries that are completely inadequate, for the purpose. And in those instances, the bank would insist, for instance, that the bank's procurement processes are used, to procure, goods and services for a project in a particular country. In those countries where you have sophisticated, procurement policies and regulations, then we will rely on the country's procurement, regulations. But I think that overall, the issue of corruption is a high rent, for Africa, and needs, concerted effort, both, I think, at the AU level, at the country levels, but also at the bank level. So obviously the continent loses a lot of money annually, from all of these illegal flows of money out of the continent. So as I said, development and successful development by a country depends on how that country conducts itself. The African Development Bank and other MDBs can only support, where, there are gaps, but I think that, the role of civil society, the role of other parties, businesses, for instance, in ensuring that they are actively involved in trying to make sure that these issues are addressed is important, because I think that what MDBs can do is to provide support and capacity to help countries that want to be helped. But I think, sort of the internal, interest groups within the country are also important.
The development journey for the continent is quite complex, and we are at a different level and pace to other parts of the world. As a bank, let's look at climate financing, for example. So on the one hand, we've got to go greener. On the other, we also have fossil fuels in abundance that we need for our development. As a bank, how do you balance the two? Your choices, and how do you advise our countries in moving forward?
So it's very important to understand that, worrying about climate and taking steps to mitigate the impacts of climate change by African countries is not any longer negotiable. I think it's quite clear that climate change is here and it's impacting countries all over the continent. But you are right, Africa's contributions to global emissions are 3–4%, so, very small. And at the same time, though, we have these massive gaps in energy, requirements. So Africa is blessed with a lot of clean energy, but a lot of that energy as well is not secure. So if it stops raining, and we've had instances on the continent in different countries where, hydroelectric power facilities are no longer performing, at their capacity because it stopped raining. There's been a drought, as an example, or the sun stops shining. I have these, solar panels on my roof, and if it rains for a few days, that power is not available. So I think that, there's a balance here, okay? So where technology is evolving, which would allow, for instance, for some of this fossil fuel to be deployed to support, African access to energy, to close that gap, that 600 million gap, and ensure that Africa can industrialize. But at the same time, I think it must be understood that given that, in fact, the impacts on Africa of climate change are probably worse than anywhere else, we simply cannot be, continually insisting on fossil fuels as the only solution, because it's the cheapest solution and most readily available solution. However, countries like Japan, for instance, have clean coal technology. And I think that, if those countries blessed with coal should be able to access, that kind of technology, and, so that they can provide access to electricity. I think this is important. So it's really about achieving a balance, between the need to protect ourselves as a continent against climate change, but also ensure that we can develop. So I'm a advocate of climate mitigation for Africa, but it should certainly not be at the expense of Africa's development.
Let's talk geopolitics for a bit now. First one. A lot of people don't know that, yes, all 54 countries on the continent are members, but there are other non-regional members. And I wonder if there is some external influence that comes to bear in the workings of the bank. And how do you navigate? We're seeing Donald Trump, for example, rewriting diplomacy, rewriting common sense, some would say. And the US I think, owns about 7.5% of the bank, if I'm not mistaken. How does one like you, particularly as president, manage these external influences and keep the agenda on the African story?
No, I think that, as I said, Africa is at an inflection point. The world is changing, rapidly. We don't know if these changes will be permanent or are temporary and are a function of the leadership that we have globally at the moment. We have to wait and see what happens. But the bank does have 27 non-regional member countries. There's obviously member countries from Asia. There's member countries from South America, but of course, the G7, if you like, are also members of the bank. The interesting thing is that the bank has had to actually grapple with these priorities, different priorities of different countries at different times. However, the North Star, if you like, is really about what the bank's mandate is. We should never, ever forget that, because our mandate is the development of the continent towards the Africa we want. So I think that in general, in fact, this combination of forces, if you like, within the development banks, and it's not just us, but the Inter-America Development Bank, for instance, is a good example of trying to balance, these forces. The fact of the matter is that if everybody on the board of directors and the board of governance understands what the bank's mandate is, then it's really a question of, okay, what expertise, what skills, what guidance do they bring towards the, I guess, the best way to actually, deliver on this mandate, and less about, you can't do this because, my country, doesn't like it. It happens. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It does happen. But I think we always come back to what is important for Africa and what is the bank's mandate. And we find ways to work with each other. So it's not new. Obviously, I've been part of these discussions. You see them, especially at a time when we are in the process of negotiating a capital increase. Countries will come and say, oh, in order to get money from us, this is what we want, this is what we want. We navigate that. It's a normal thing. And of course, every 3 years, there are replenishment discussions of the African Development Fund. And again, the same issues, come up. So where I think that there's generally goodwill, from all member countries to see Africa succeed. And I think also, despite what's in the media, I think that cooler heads everywhere are also thinking about the opportunity that Africa represents. And while it may look like, doom and gloom, the fact of the matter is that the world's, green minerals are in Africa. The youth population, the youth dividend, that we talk about, this great asset that we have is here in Africa. And I think it would take a really brave soul to say, right off the whole continent. So I'm not necessarily concerned that there isn't a path to consensus on, on the role of the AfDB in the bank.
All right, so that's external pressures, external views. Some argue that the African Development Bank ought to be more vocal on issues like governance and human rights issues in some of the member countries. What's your view as someone that's worked in the bank and wants to be president of the bank?
My view is very simple, and if you speak to any staff of the bank, they will tell you that the charter of the bank is very clear about our non-involvement in politics, and a lot of these issues are politics. They are complex. I know that there's a lot of pressure, for different constituencies to push for particular agendas, for instance, whether you're looking at LGBTQ. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of these very same constituencies who are pushing for Africa to rush to making decisions around these issues have been grappling with these issues for the last 50 years. So I think that, there is an argument to say that, countries should be allowed to evolve to a position where there is consensus in the country. Having said that, though, we are very, very clear that the projects that are funded by the African Development Bank will benefit everyone, regardless of, their political, affiliation or, their sexual orientation, all of these issues. Because our mandate is the development of Africa and improving the lives of all Africans, not some Africans. So where that is our, guiding light, if we were, for instance, told by any government, that you can do this project, but we don't want you to benefit those people, well, fact of the matter is that we're not doing that project. It's as simple as that. So but also I think it's important to note that it's complex. These issues are complex, and the role of stakeholders within the country are just as important in what we say and announce. I know that one of our peers, announced that they were stopping funding to a particular country because of LGBTQ issues. They've had to reverse themselves, because, I guess when cooler heads prevailed, they realized that these are complex issues. And, I think that there are many countries in Africa who would be denied funding, for these political issues unfairly. because a lot of the people of that country deserve our support.
All right, and perhaps finally, this bank since 1964, the mandate and the issues that were on the table at that time, quite different to 2025. And so the bank has had to evolve over time. Each leadership has come in and has moved the bank forward. How are you going to evolve the bank, especially given the era that we're living in history?
So what I think that my interest is making sure that we have a lot more ownership of our future. And that really means that we need to collaborate and coordinate and plan together for development of Africa. That means we need to speak with one voice for development of Africa. So where I am very, very interested in making sure that all of these parties start to align and work together with countries, with the AU, to make sure that we, as much as possible, first of all, benefit from the wealth of our country, and that's our countries or our continent. And that is, our mineral wealth, for instance, but also our young people and their talents. Women, many of whom are still excluded from economic participation. But also, I think that it's very, very important that we mobilize the private sector on the continent to be a partner, a long-term partner in Africa's development. And that means that we as MDBs need to work with countries to make sure that they create a climate that allows the private sector to actually be a partner in development. I think Africa has plenty of resources to be able to do what it needs to do for its own development. And it's a question really of making that commitment. So I hope that I can walk away from this job at the end of my tenure with really demonstrable impact and demonstrable results from transformational projects that really move the continent forward. And for me, that's really moving the needle on growth. Africa needs to grow, but also on moving the needle on job creation, industrialization, and making sure that Africa is also trading with itself.
And that's how we come to the end of today's edition of Channel Africa Conversations. Join us again next time, but before I go, we'd love to hear more from you. We want to know what kind of conversations you like us to have and with whom. So please engage with us on our social media platforms. They're on your screen now. And share your thoughts with us. In fact, you can start right here and make your comments in the comment section below. From me and the team, until the next time, goodbye.